And welcome to our SEVP COVID-19 and other guidelines update for summer 2021. My name is Ron Cushing. I'm Director of UC International Services, and I'll be leading this discussion. We hope everybody is staying safe during this pandemic, and we realize everybody has a lot of questions about what summer looks like and what you might be able to and can do, and we're going to try to address all of those things during this webinar. We will be recording the webinar and posting it on our website, so don't feel compelled to have to write everything down. Our program manager, Lori Blanton, will be sending out an email blast to students when this is posted. For this webinar, please make sure your microphone stays on mute. And if you have questions along the way, please use the chat function to ask your questions. I have a staff member, Sarah O'Connell, who's going to be trying to respond as best she can to the chat questions. Once I've completed my formal presentation, I'll bring Sarah into the presentation live to ask me any questions she has not been able to respond to in the chat. And that is how the presentation will go. And so why don't we get right into the presentation? All right, so everybody who's on this call obviously should be a current international student, not an incoming international student. Some of you may have been here since last March when the pandemic started. Others of you may have started in the fall or maybe even this spring in January. But the SEVP is the Student and Exchange Visitor Information Program, and they set guidelines for F1 and J1 international students. And since the pandemic started, they have obviously eased a lot of their normal enrollment requirements and other regulations. And it's important to understand how those will continue throughout the summer. In addition, COVID-19 has created a lot of other issues for students, whether it's their desire to travel safely or not. There's a lot of embassies and so forth overseas that are still either closed or not operating properly. And we're going to try to address all of those different issues so you know what you can and should be doing for this summer. Now, the first thing is, you got to understand that the Department of Homeland Security has relaxed many of the enrollment regulations for F1 and J1 students. But there are two groups of students. There are those who were present last March. It's hard to believe this has been going on for a year already, but it has been. So there's those who were here last March when the pandemic began. And then there are those who have been here only since either last fall or this spring after pandemic relief was in place. And so regardless of the group you fall in, you need to understand what your enrollment requirements are, what your travel options are for the summer. And we're going to try to address those during this seminar. First, I want to start with the rules for students who were in the U.S. March 2020 or before. So at this time last year, you were in the U.S. on an F1 or J1 visa. The Department of Homeland Security has relaxed many of the rules and regulations for you, including the fact that you can be enrolled in any combination of courses, including all online courses. When the pandemic is not in place, there are limits to how many online courses you can be enrolled for. If you were here last March or before, there are no limits while the pandemic is ongoing on how many online courses you can be enrolled for. If you decided to leave the U.S. and you're currently not in the U.S., but you were here last March, we were allowed to keep your SEVIS record active. And as long as you were enrolled full time, your record would be considered what it would be as if you were here. You could accumulate the time spent enrolled online from abroad towards qualifying for optional and curricular practical training. This guidance remains unchanged and will be in place through the summer semester 2001. Now that's for people who were here March 2020 or before. Now, if you are on the line and you enrolled from UC for the first time, either fall 2020 or spring 21, the rules are a little bit different for you. Upon arrival and enrollment, you had to make sure that not only were you enrolled in a full course of study, but that at least one of those classes was an in-person class. Now, students who enroll summer semester can enroll for all online courses. The in-person requirement only applies to the first semester of study in the US and not during the remainder of the pandemic. So this is a brand new change that we just learned about. Last fall, we thought it was going to have to be, if you started in the fall, you'd have to be enrolled for spring in one in-person, for summer one in-person. The in-person requirement only applies to your first semester of study. After that, you too can now become all online if you want for the summer. However, any student who enrolled online from outside the US before entering cannot count that time towards fulfilling CPT or OPT eligibility. I'll give you an example. New student enrolled for the first time fall semester, then came in person for spring semester. The time you spent enrolled in the fall will not be able to be counted towards your eligibility for optional or curricular practical training. Only your time from spring semester on would. But the good news is if you enroll all online for the summer, between spring and summer, you would then be eligible for curricular or optional practical training beginning this fall. Now, many of you on the call might be currently enrolled from outside the US and be planning your return either this summer or this fall. And for those of you who are in that situation, let me tell you the steps that you have to take. First, you need to make sure that you have a valid F1 or J1 visa stamp in your passport. You've got to keep in mind that many embassies are still currently closed or operating under limited staff. So if you need a visa, you need to make sure that you get in line as quickly as you can to get that appointment to make sure you can come back when you desire. Now, you also need to make sure that page 2 of your I-20, or if you're a J1, page 1 of your DS 2019 is signed for travel within the past 12 months or of the date you wish to re-enter. If you are currently on practical training, it should be signed within the past 6 months. If you need a travel signature, submit our travel signature request e-form in our iBearcats global system. It'll be found under either the F1 or J1 Student Services menu. You also have to keep in mind that travel restrictions do exist for certain countries, and you will have to follow quarantine guidelines upon your reentry. So if you will be traveling to the US by air, regardless of where you're coming from, you will have to show a negative COVID-19 test within 3 days of your scheduled flight. Or you would have to show documentation that within the past 3 months, you have been diagnosed and recovered from COVID-19. That's very important. In some countries, getting a COVID-19 test is not going to be an easy thing to do, and you're going to have to show a negative test within 3 days of re-entering if you plan to travel. There have also been, over the past year, many US presidential proclamations prohibiting the entry into the US of anyone who had spent time during the previous 14 days in certain countries. The prime countries affected by this are Brazil, China, Iran, and about 30 European countries. I'm not going to list them all out during this session, but a list can be found on the link on the screen. The good news is F1 student visa holders have recently been granted a national interest exemption, and will be permitted to enter within the previous 14 days, even if you were in one of those countries. J1 student visa holders would have to contact the embassy to be granted an exemption. Upon your reentry, the University of Cincinnati will continue to require quarantine of all international travelers. We consider international travel to be a high risk for contracting the COVID-19 virus. All students should already have the UC COVID Check app downloaded on their computer or phone. But if not, you definitely need to make sure you do it before you travel. If in fact you plan to travel, you have to use the UC COVID Check app to report your travel and then have your quarantine monitored upon return. Upon return, you will be quarantining for a minimum of 7 days. UC will offer a PCR test between day 5 and 7 upon your return. And so depending on how quickly that test gets scheduled and the results come back, you could be released on day 7 or day 8 if you have a negative test. Ultimately, you're going to have to use the app to make that test, and if negative, you would be allowed out. If not, or you decide not to take the test, you will have to quarantine for a full 10 days upon your return from your travel. You also need to keep in mind that some U.S. consulates and embassies are currently closed or not operating at full capacity. In particular, if you're from China, for example, the Chinese embassies or the U.S. embassies in China have yet to reopen for even minor operations. We hope that changes in the near future, but there is no guarantee on that. You need to make sure that you're checking the website of the consulate or embassy that you intend to use if you need to apply for a visa when you travel. You also have to keep in mind that things can change. An embassy may currently be open today and you decide to travel, then when you get home, COVID-19 goes a little wacky where you're at and they have to close again. So there is risk for traveling during this pandemic. Things that are true today may not be true tomorrow. Now, when it comes to recommending whether or not you should travel for the summer, the CDC recommends that no one travel internationally at this time. And the university supports the CDC recommendations. Our recommendation is, unless it is absolutely necessary, there are too many variables in play, whether it's getting a COVID-19 test, further outbreaks potentially happening while you're gone, all of those things. Travel is a risk. And if you need to get a visa stamp, that risk goes way up due to processing times at embassies and current closures. And so you got to keep all of that in mind when you're deciding if you're going to travel for the summer or not. The safest thing to do, obviously, is stay in the U.S. And not travel. But some students will want to do that anyway. And, again, it'll be up to you to balance all of these different issues when deciding whether or not to travel. Now, current students who are enrolled for spring are asking us, do we have to be enrolled for the summer? And the summer, unless your program mandates summer enrollment, is always considered a vacation term. And if you are here now and you want to take the summer off and either stay in the U.S., again, which we encourage, or travel back home, you can certainly do that. But unless you're here and enrolled full time, you won't be able to count the summer as part of fulfilling your CPT or OPT eligibility requirements. Only being here and enrolled is full time is going to count the summer towards that threshold. Now, if you are on optional practical training, under normal circumstances, when you're on post-completion or the STEM OPT extension, you must be working at least 20 hours per week while you're on practical training. For the duration of the COVID-19 pandemic, students who are working less than 20 hours will be considered to be maintaining status. During the 12-month OPT period, volunteer activities count. During the STEM OPT extension, volunteer activities do not count. But if you are working any number of hours, even less than 20, you can still remain active on OPT. Now, the big question is, for those of you who have been gone for some time and are currently outside the United States, getting close to graduating, wanting to know, can I apply for OPT if I'm not in the US? SEVP has not provided any formal guidance on this yet, and actually they would have to deal with the US Citizenship and Immigration Services to get an answer on that. But technically, the application says you must be in the US when you apply, and so that is our formal recommendation. If you plan to apply for OPT and you're currently outside the US, you should get in the US to apply. If you try to apply from outside, you obviously need to have a US address on the application or it won't be processed. We're not going to monitor all of that very closely, but there is great risk if you are not in the United States and you apply for optional practical training. So if you're going to be graduating in the spring, graduating in the summer, and you're currently abroad, our best advice is come back to the US, then apply. We're also getting questions about COVID-19 expenses and what is covered by the UC student health insurance policy. First, COVID-19 testing is done here at the university free of charge to students. And if you do contract COVID-19 and you need treatment, the expenses would be covered like any other expense for an accident or an illness. There's obviously deductibles that have to be paid, but otherwise the cost would be covered by the student health insurance policy. For more information on what's covered, go to the student health insurance page and look at the appropriate link. Now, those are some of the questions that we've gotten, but we also get very targeted questions from some students that we're going to put into this presentation. And let's start with the first one here. I am a student planning an overseas trip this summer. What should I do and who should I contact? And some of these questions are meant to be a recap of some of the things that I just covered. So, all personal international travel is strongly discouraged by any UC community member. You gotta weigh the risks and benefits of international travel at this time, and I talked about a lot of those things. Students planning any travel abroad for the summer are advised to first monitor the CDC guidance regarding travel restrictions, and if your visa stamp is not valid for entry, you need to check with the U.S. consulate or embassy in that city about your ability to obtain a visa appointment. If you're going to travel back home, but that consulate is closed and you need a visa stamp, you may want to rethink travel. If you don't have a currently up-to-date signature on your I-20 or DS-2019, make sure you obtain a travel signature before you leave if one is needed. Next question, if I decide to travel internationally despite the strong recommendation not to travel and government restrictions prevent me from re-entering the US, what happens to my F1 or J1 student immigration status? Now, the current guidance is in place through summer 2021, meaning if you travel and you can't come back for the moment, your SEVIS records will remain valid. But what happens in the fall is unknown. UC has not formally decided what instruction will look like in the fall. We want and hope for it to be back to normal and in person, but there's no guarantee that that will happen. The state of Ohio certainly will help mandate what is or is not possible. And then the SEVP program can certainly change their guidance on what is currently in place. So the answer is we don't have a concrete answer for what happens if you go home and can't come back this fall yet. Another reason to think very carefully about whether or not you want to travel. But we will certainly let everyone know when we have more definitive information about what fall is going to look like. This is for sure. If UC decides that we are going to be back in person in the fall, but COVID-19, lack of visa appointments or anything else cause you not to be able to come back, your F1 or J1 record will have to be terminated at that point. But again, we'll have to provide more clarification about this, once those things are more clear. Another question, I have arrived in the U.S. for the first time spring semester 2021 and enrolled full-time. I am planning to enroll full-time summer semester as well, and I plan to begin my co-op or capstone requirement fall 2021. Will I be eligible for CPT fall semester? And the answer is yes, you will. So you will be eligible if you enrolled full-time spring and full-time summer for fall curricular practical training. Next question. I arrived in the U.S. for the first time spring semester 2021. Can I take summer semester off as a vacation term? Yes, any student who was enrolled spring 2021 can take summer off as a vacation term, provided you plan to enroll full-time fall 2021. Now, I will put a caveat on this that some graduate programs may have different curricular requirements. And before you just decide to take off the summer, you need to make sure that the program doesn't have an issue with it. But from an immigration perspective, you can certainly take the summer off and stay here. Or again, if you feel compelled to travel, go home. But again, our recommendation is you stay here in the U.S. Next question, I'm graduating spring semester and I'm from a CDC level 3 warning country. What are my options if I want to avoid returning home immediately due to COVID-19? So for this question, obviously you're concerned about going home and your safety upon going home and you'd like to stay here longer. One option, if you're eligible, is to apply for optional practical training. So the window in which to apply plus the unemployment provisions would allow you to remain in the U.S. for at least 5 months after graduation if you apply for OPT. There are specific instructions that you have to follow to apply for practical training on our website. Follow the link. There is a $410 cost to apply for practical training, but it will buy you at least 5 months in the U.S. after graduation. You also have the ability to file for a tourist visa if you want within the United States. You'd have to document that COVID is severe in your country and that you want to stay here for safety reasons. But typically a B2 application would be approved for this purpose, and they're normally approved for 6 months. You could then also apply for an extension for another 6 months if the situation is the same. The cost to apply for a change of status to tourist visa is $455, and it's done on the USCIS form I-539. Unfortunately, we cannot help you apply for a tourist visa, but the instructions are fairly straightforward, and it is another option if you feel compelled to stay here due to the conditions in your country due to COVID-19. Now, everything we talked about today is subject to change. This is a very fluid situation. It's fluid from the pandemic standpoint. you know, as you've watched over the last year, you know, it's ebbed and flowed. The university will make decisions on what our registration will look like. The state may mandate certain things, and then ultimately the Student and Exchange Visitor Information System, you know, will provide further guidance. When we hear any changes, we will certainly let you know. Now, students with additional visa or immigration questions can call our front desk, 556-4278, or send an email to international.students@uc.edu. We will be posting this presentation on our website. We've got to do a couple things after it's done to clean up the recording and so forth, but we will send out an email blast to students when it is posted. And again, I can't stress this enough. Everything is subject to change, and the university does have a website where we try to keep this information up to date. The link is on the screen, and when you go there, there is a frequently asked questions for international students section that you can use to try to stay up to date with all of this. Now, with that, that is my formal presentation, and I know Sarah O'Connell from my office has been working diligently during my presentation to try to keep up with questions in the chat. And at this point, I'm going to ask Sarah to come in and verbally ask some questions that we haven't gotten to yet in the chat, and we will answer the questions verbally. Sarah, jump on in here.
Thanks, Ron. I think we got most of the questions answered, thankfully, but I think maybe just a general overview of the requirements for summer for all the different populations we're talking about today in terms of, do I need to enroll? Am I allowed to stay in the U.S.? That seems to be the area of most concern.
So the first thing is, anybody can take summer off and remain in the U.S., and that's what we encourage everybody to do. Now, some of you are in programs that either started in the fall and are continuing in spring, and you might have a curricular practical training requirement that's going to start in the fall, for which you would need to be registered in the summer. So if you entered for the first time this spring, in order for you to be eligible to do co-ops, capstones, and other things, and in particular, I'm more concerned with graduate programs in engineering and business. You know, your programs have those requirements or options. You want to take advantage of them. If spring semester was your first semester in person here, you're going to need to be enrolled in the summer. It can be online, but you will not be eligible for CPT unless you were enrolled spring and summer in the U.S. And so make sure that you enroll accordingly and discuss with your programs what your options or requirements are for fall, so you don't inadvertently take summer off and then come fall you realize now you're not eligible to engage in your capstone. So hopefully that summarizes the options, but anybody can take summer off as vacation, and you can stay here, and we encourage you to stay here, because again, travel is going to be a risk. You're going to have to go through a lot of hoops upon return for quarantine and other things. And you know, there's a possibility that if you leave, you may not be able to come back as planned.
We also had a couple students ask if proof of a vaccine would be sufficient if they're re-entering the U.S.
The proof of vaccine is not sufficient. It's a COVID test that you have to produce. The vaccine alone will not work.
I think that should be it in terms of the most frequently asked questions. But I think we got everybody else. Certainly email us international.students@uc.edu if something comes up, and we'll be happy to help.
Great. Well, again, thank you all for tuning in. As Sarah said, call us or email us with questions, and we will let you know when this presentation is posted on our website. Otherwise, please, everyone, stay safe and healthy.
I have a question, sorry.
Enjoy your summer regardless of what your plans are.
Hello? Hi, I have a question.
If you have a question, we request that you call the general line, send us an email, please.
Okay, sure, thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording, Ron.
Yes, please stop the recording. Thanks.